Does anyone know where the love of God goes? When a single flash turns the night to day, and a blast pulses at the speed of sound through flesh and bone, leaving it utterly unidentifiable.
Once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know.
Welcome to Not Forgotten, a weekly podcast sharing the stories of a place known as Utah's Dixie, and brought to you by the Doc Booth Foundation. Through stories as universal as they are personal, this podcast is dedicated to the memory of legendary family physician Dr. Craig Booth and to defining, preserving, and perpetuating the spirit of Dixie embodied in his life and work.
Hi, I'm Lyman Hafen, host of the Not Forgotten podcast. For more than 40 years, I've been writing and publishing with the intent of connecting landscape and story in the American Southwest. I believe the words spoken by a character in a story by Barry Lopez. Everything is held together by stories, he said. That is all that is holding us together, stories and compassion. Dr. Craig Booth was a man of stories and compassion. His personal story is one of the many that have made Utah's Dixie what it is, and his compassion is at the heart of that elusive entity we call the Dixie Spirit. In this episode, we're going to talk about St. George's greatest tragedy. It was a moment in time in the mid-1930s, a moment in time when things changed greatly in this little town as 10 people died one night in a very tragic situation. I'm sharing this story based on writings that I've done over the years, information that I've compiled from visiting with my father and with other people who know these stories. Also from newspaper stories. There's not a lot of information about this tragedy because I think it's something the town kind of wanted to forget, even though we need to and always have remembered and memorialized the wonderful people who died that night. The story that I'm sharing is, these are words that I've written, and I feel very grateful and appreciative that David Lee sat down many years ago with us and recorded a lot of these words. David is a retired professor of literature at Southern Utah University. He was Utah's first poet laureate, and his roots run very, very deep in Utah's Dixie, although he lived much of his early life in Texas and carries that Texas accent with him. But he's such a wonderful storyteller, and I'm grateful that his voice comes into this podcast today. And I thank him and I honor him for his amazing work.
Late in the evening of March 6, 1935, the heavens above the peaceful hamlet of St. George, Utah, filled with a flash that blinded even the stars, and the earth jolted with a boom that nearly toppled folks off their feet, and the light and the boom were seen and heard as far away as 40 miles. When the stars reappeared and the explosion's echo settled into silence, everyone knew something dreadful had happened. And by morning, the entire town would know that the hopes and dreams of a generation had been snuffed out by that flash and blown to oblivion by that boom. Even more tragic for nearly every St. George resident who awoke to the news that morning was the fact that someone they knew had died instantly in the blast. Someone they knew had not gone gentle into that good night. The St. George oil well explosion of March 6, 1935, instantly claimed the lives of 9 people, and before the sun could rise, another succumbed to serious injury, making the total loss of life 10 souls, men and women, each of whom represented the various sectors of society in this small Mormon town, each of whom had, by the fickle nature of fate, found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. What's more, many of the townsfolk who awoke to the tragic news that morning also awoke to the realization that the bell could have just as easily been tolling for them.
When I was a boy, my father told me of a tragedy that happened in my hometown 30 years before I was born. He said it was the worst thing that had ever happened in our community, and that most people my age had never heard of it. And he said those who knew of it and those who had experienced it had done their best to forget it. But my dad, who was just 3 years old when it happened, didn't think people should forget. He believed it was a story everyone who lives here should know and remember. One day, when we were driving back to town from the Arizona Strip, he asked me if I'd like to see where it happened. I said I would, and he drove me there. And as we arrived, I was struck by 2 things. First, how close it was to town, and second, how in spite of the inexpressible disaster that occurred there that night so long ago, almost no evidence existed to tell the tale of the most horrific event in our town's history. That was my brother Ed sharing his memory of Dad exposing him to this tragic story. And I remember my own experience of being exposed to it as a boy as well, and how tragic it felt and how horrific it seemed to know that something like that had happened not only in our community, but just really in just as part of our hometown story. I think Dad felt like it should be shared with future generations. It's not a story of greed. It's a story of hope in a community to build something economically and to be able to, as you put it in its context, right smack in the middle of the Depression, these folks were excited about what the oil economy could mean to St. George. But obviously it didn't happen, and there's more story to tell here. I'm going to share a little bit more with you from things that I've written, and then we'll come back to the poet David Lee, who shares this story so wonderfully. Modern-day southern Utahns would likely name the Virgin and Santa Clara River flood of early January 2005 as the worst disaster ever in this community. 1 life and more than $20 million worth of property were lost in that flood. Before that, they might have pointed to the Quail Creek dike failure of New Year's Day, 1989, as the most notable disaster in the town's history. An estimated $12 million in damage resulted from that flood. Yet, fortunately, no lives were lost. The same cannot be said of the fatal explosion that rocked Utah's Dixie on the evening of March 6, 1935. Few people today know that on that night, nearly 8 decades ago, 10 persons were killed as they stood by ready to see history made. They were among some 100 townspeople who gathered at the side of a hopeful oil well just a few miles south of what is now Bloomington Hills, where a charge of explosives was sure to bring in the well and send St. George gushing into the future. Instead, those who survived witnessed what must have been the most devastating single moment in St. George's history. Before the charge could be lowered into the well, it accidentally exploded. In 1 millisecond, the blast ended the lives of company employees and innocent spectators and brought down the curtains on many an oil-drenched dream. It was the beginning of the end of the oil business in Utah's Dixie. For 8 decades, the site of southern Utah's worst disaster has been tucked away out of sight of the general public. Every year, there are fewer and fewer folks still living who can even show you exactly where it was. With the opening of the new Southern Parkway leading east off Interstate 15 south of St. George, the site can now be easily viewed as you drive along the blacktop stretch of the parkway between the interstate and the new St. George Airport. Easily viewed, that is, if you're fortunate enough to have someone along who can point it out. Not a hint of the oil derrick or any other man-made article remains on the landscape where the tragedy occurred. You could walk across that windswept, brush-covered acre where once an iron tower stood and never know you had crossed it. Few, if any, of those present that night are still alive. It's a story, well, actually, I will insert here that I wrote this piece several years ago, and it's very obvious that no one who might have been there that night is still alive. My dad, who's 92, was 3 years old at the time. It's a story not often told these days, and its most graphic details have been buried along with those who lived through them.
A different story brought each of the 10 victims to the oil derrick that night. They, along with the other 2,000 residents of St. George, had waked with a palpable sense of hope that morning. It was the springing of the year, and the hint of cherry blossoms filled the air with an expectant freshness. The townsfolk had hosted the Arrowhead Oil Company since August of 1933, and several locals had found gainful employment with the company at the height of the Great Depression. Drilling in the hills south of town had proceeded intermittently for nearly 2 years, with local men on the crew at the drilling sites and local women performing secretarial duties at the company's office in downtown St. George. Over the preceding winter, hopes had grown that the Escalante No. 2 would come in with oil and change forever the bleak economic prospects of a town depending almost entirely on subsistence agriculture. For nearly 75 years, ever since Brigham Young had called more than 300 families to settle this corner of Utah, folks had struggled in a climate of extremes, surviving floods and droughts, failed crops and poor grazing. They had plenty of successes to be proud of, such as building magnificent structures like the St. George Tabernacle and Temple. But by the 1920s, the town was surviving on little more than the hopes and dreams of its inhabitants. On the bright side, oil had been discovered in 1907 in the Virgin area, as well as the Bloomington Dome south of St. George. It seemed at last a better future was in sight, as Charles Alsop and his Arrowhead Oil Company had assembled the capital and the know-how to finally go after the black gold. Of course, Mr. Alsop would be there to see the well come in. And of course, he would want his dear wife to be there as well. That same sense of destiny prompted Charles Alsop to invite anyone who wanted to come to celebrate the occasion. Each of his employees was expected to be there, including the local women who worked as secretaries in his office. That's why Leah Cottam, a St. George girl, single, and in her mid-20s, appeared at the derrick that night. Does anyone know where the love of God goes? When a single flash turns the night to day, and a blast pulses at the speed of sound through flesh and bone, leaving it utterly unidentifiable. The explosion broke the glass and tore the top off Mr. Pickett's new Ford V8. Did likewise to Ray Nelson's car and to that of Joseph Impey. It plowed parts of everything in its path into the nearby hillside, completely devoured the 120-foot steel derrick, and threw timbers and tin 100 yards in all directions. Oil and dynamite toppled and ignited as a fire consumed the derrick and adjoining buildings. Mr. Alsop, Mr. Impey, Mr. Nicholson, and Mr. Maloney were blown into so many pieces nothing was ever found large enough to identify and say it belonged to them. Mrs. Snow, Mrs. Alsop, and Ray Nelson were most likely killed instantly, their bodies later charred by the fire. A local man, Walt Brooks, later said his best friend, Ray Nelson, was identified by his Dixie belt buckle. Mr. Kittelman and Mr. Flickinger were likewise blown apart and burned until it was difficult to identify them. Sweet Erickson suffered serious injuries but survived, and Bert Covington escaped with shock, broken eardrums, and minor bruises. Rosamond Snow was rushed to the hospital where she was expected to die, but raging against the dying of the light, she made it through the night, having lost part of the left side of her face, including her eye. Carrying thereafter the scars of that horrific night, Rosamond Snow lived a long and productive life in St. George. Leah Cottam, the bright young woman whose promising life lay before her, died in the hospital a few hours after the explosion.
As a boy growing up in St. George in the 1960s, I was acquainted with some of the survivors of this tragedy, and I heard some of the stories about it. But one of the stories that my dad shared with me, and I remember hearing it many years ago, and then more recently, Dad sharing with me a typescript that had actually been written by Una Pickett. The story that Una shares is profound and is amazing and wonderful, actually, in spite of this tragedy. And as I read that typescript and translated it into words that I could share in my own writing, that was when I felt like, my goodness, I need a voice like David Lee to tell this story. David was he was surprised that I would ask him to do it. He said, "What are you doing asking someone with the Texas accent to tell a St. George story?" But David Lee was the first poet laureate of Utah, and he is such an awesome teller of stories. Well, poet first and foremost, but teller of stories. And for us to have the opportunity to hear Una Pickett's story in David's voice, I just felt like that would be so wonderful. And so here now the story continues.
Stories still swirl like shifty dust devils through the creosote and black brush on the desert hills south of St. George, Utah. They're stories of how fate brought one person to the oil well that night and kept another person home. For decades, men and women have grown old in this town, wondering if it hadn't been for the high school basketball game in Cedar City that night, if it hadn't been for one random reason or another, would they have been standing there under the stars, looking up at the towering derrick that night? One story cuts to the heart of this tragedy in a way that could represent all the others. On the day of March 6, 1935, both Leah Cottam and a fellow oil company secretary named Una Pickett grew more and more excited as news came into the office that the well would be shot that evening. Leah and Una had grown up together as classmates in the same St. George neighborhood, and they were dearest friends. It seemed to them a historic day in their little town, a day when its economic future could shift with one glorious blast deep inside the earth. As 5 p.m. rolled around, Leah and Una locked up the office in downtown St. George. As they were leaving, one of the workmen told them, "Hurry home and get something to eat, and someone would come by to pick them up and take them to the drilling site." They walked and talked beneath the sheltering boughs of the mulberry trees along the 2 or 3 blocks to their homes. As they reached Una's house, they said goodbye, and Leah continued the half-block to her house. Una went inside, and for reasons she could never explain, lay down on her bed and was soon asleep. Leah arrived home to a bustling house where her parents and 7 brothers and sisters were getting ready for supper. She told them about this night's exciting event, and her mother reminded her of her chiropractic appointment that evening, and that Dr. Harris would be arriving shortly for the house call. Leah said if the doctor came first, she would not go with her associates out to the well, but if the company car came first, she would miss her appointment and go. Later, a car pulled up in front of the Cottam home, and Leah went to the door to see who it was. She turned to her parents and said, "The wrong car came," and she was off. Leah Cottam's heart must have danced in her chest as she arrived at the oil derrick that night. Her friend Una was still asleep at home. The local electrician, Joseph Impey, objected to allowing anyone on the site who was not absolutely necessary. But Mr. Alsop would not hear of it. His own wife stood at his side near the derrick platform. Leah Cottam stood next to her friend Rosamond Snow, who had come with her mother Olive. As the moment drew nearer, each expressed an intuition, a bad feeling about the whole situation, and they turned and started to run, and suddenly the night was shattered by the blast, and in the chaotic aftermath, both Rosamond and Leah, along with the other wounded, were driven to the hospital in St. George, just a couple of blocks from the Cottam home. Leah died there between 2 and 3 a.m. Una Pickett later recalled how she had uncharacteristically fallen asleep that evening, and how that simple fact had kept her home safe in bed that night. And she also talked of the dream she had that awoke her between 2 and 3 a.m. It was a dream of all her classmates going to a funeral, all of them except one. Leah appeared to Una in that dream to tell her she would not be able to go with them.
I don't know how old I was when I first saw the photograph of the funeral in the tabernacle, the funeral that was held a few days later for 7 victims of the oil well explosion. It's a photograph that, for anyone who grew up here and maybe saw it at a young age, it's something that you never forget. The tabernacle is jam-packed with people. Looks like maybe everybody in town went to that funeral. And there are 4 caskets at the front of or just below the podium. It's actually a joint funeral for 7 people, but 3 of them, there were no remains to be found. The flowers, the lighting, the feeling in that photo is a feeling of grief and of sadness and of perhaps even horror. And I just wonder, everyone who is sitting there is probably thinking, I might have been there myself. And I think that it's true. There were 100 people that gathered there that evening. There wasn't a lot of thought about safety, although as we know that Joseph Empey, the electrician, was not happy that people were not kept further away, and he expected that and had pushed for that. But I think that sense of celebration that everyone had, being there, being a part of history, it was something really special. But the sad thing is that they did become part of history, but not in the way that everyone had hoped, because this really was a hopeful time, a hopeful situation right in the middle of the Great Depression. The idea that oil might be taken out of the ground right here in our community and bring a level of economic success to the community was something that everyone, I'm sure, was hopeful about. The quote from that Clark Empey, and I knew Clark Empey as I was growing up in St. George. He was the son of Joseph Empey. Also, Clark is also an electrician. He said that this tragedy touched every life in town, either through deep friendship or relation. And that's the part of it that I think kind of haunts me, and I think probably haunted everyone, was, wow, what if I would have been there? I know that I have an uncle who had intended to be there, but didn't end up going. And my children's great-great-great-grandfather, Bert Covington, was there. And he was injured to some degree. But it's something that really gives you pause to stop and think about. But as you think about Leah Cottom and her story, and Una Pickett, and those two young women with their lives ahead of them, and one went and one didn't, and it just comes down to that question of fate and destiny and all of those things. But we know that in this world, horrible things happen, and God allows horrible things to happen. And moving forward, it's up to us to find the answers, and many of us find our answers in different ways. If you look at this story and how the community rose from it, faith is a really integral part of it. And that faith is an integral part of the Dixie spirit that continues today, and that really makes this a singular place, because it is a place that was founded on the faith of those original settlers. And that faith became paramount and crucial and so important during those tragic days in the mid-1930s. And going forward, it's just amazing to think of what a people and a community can pass through and transcend, and how a community can come out of the depths of tragedy and become the community that we are today. It wasn't oil that saved us. It was not oil that made us the place that everyone wants to come to, the place that everyone wants to live now. It's the spirit of the people. It's that Dixie spirit. It's that can-do spirit. And it's really the beauty of that spirit combined with the landscape and the goodness of this community. I think that what really defines this community and its spirit is that feeling that comes out of the faith that became what we now know as the Dixie spirit.
The Doc Booth Foundation is dedicated to empowering individuals through educational opportunities and promoting mental health advocacy. Through scholarships and funding for important community needs, the foundation perpetuates the can-do spirit of the founders of this community, using the lessons of the past to chart the course for a better future. Make your tax-deductible donation at docboothfoundation.org. Not Forgotten is produced by Ricky Valadez and made possible by the generous support of St. George Area Zag Stores, industry-leading tech support and accessories. Lyman Hafen's books can be found at lymanhafen.com.
Once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know. We came to Dixie, and we called it home. Oh, in Dixie, we've lived and grown. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know. The hot winds whirl around me and take away my breath. I've had the chills and fever till I'm nearly shook to death. All earthly tribulations are but a moment here. And oh, if I prove faithful, a righteous crown I'll wear. We came to Dixie, and we called it home. Oh, in Dixie, we've lived and grown. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know. I hope that there's a heaven with rivers pure and clean. But I know that there are others who will come here after me. Though I may never see it as a garden lined with trees. If this desert's gonna blossom, I'd better plant the seeds. 'Cause they'll come to Dixie, and they'll call it home. Oh, in Dixie, they'll live and grow. They'll come to Dixie, and they'll call it home. Oh, in Dixie, they'll live and grow. And the reason why they sent me, I think I found